Hello and welcome dear learners to the NPTEL course on Healthcare Quality Management, Infection Control and Patient Safety. In the Module 3, Patient Safety Management, Infection Control and Medication Safety, we will dwell into the chapter 27 on Infection Control Practices Part 3, where we will be discussing on standard precautions, isolation precautions and droplet precautions. What are standard precautions to be taken as? As it is always followed by all healthcare workers and need to be taken by them seriously, the aim of standard precaution is to reduce the risk of transmission of microorganisms by putting a barrier between the healthcare worker, blood, and the blood fluids of any patient. The key components are hand hygiene, personal protective equipments, that is PPE, and use of this PPE when handling blood, blood substances, secretions and excretions. Housekeeping staff needs to properly handle of patient care equipments and soiled linen. Prevention of needle stick and sharp injuries need to be taken care thoroughly. Environmental cleaning and spill management. Source segregation of biomedical waste, proper handling and disposal of waste. These are encountered as standard precautions to reduce the risk of transmission of microorganisms. Here we can see the figure on what are the different standard precautions that we need to take, especially with respect to the sharp safety. Actually, we may find that it is to be done with respect to actually first putting an end with the boxes while cutting the needles. Standard precautions with respect to hand hygiene, where we have emphasized in the previous chapter of it is running flow water or even alcohol hand scrub. PPE use and housekeeping, environmental cleaning and waste segregations. These are one of those standard precautions that every healthcare workers need to emphasize more on. What are now the isolation precautions we will discuss? Isolation of patient has been recognized as one of the modes of preventing the transmission of infectious agents. Isolation has also been seen as two set of preventive measures to reduce the rate of healthcare associated infections or called as hospital acquired infections, which has been proven to increase morbidity, mortality and healthcare cost. This helps control the spread of multi-drug resistance organism, a major global health crisis that we are witnessing. So what is the purpose of isolation precautions? The purpose of isolation precaution is to provide recommendations for infection control across all healthcare settings, especially primary healthcare centers, teaching hospitals, medical colleges, long-term care centers, private hospital settings, healthcare personnel. Also it is very useful at an individual level to see this, and even hospital administrators would demonstrate the leadership of taking these initiatives ahead, or anyone who is seeking infection control guidance. What are airborne infections? And with airborne infections, what are the precautions to take care? Airborne infections are one which are transmitted through the spread of airborne route. And for airborne infections to tackle, we need to have airborne precautions. These precautions are designed to reduce the transmission of diseases spread by the airborne route. Airborne transmission occurs when droplet nuclei above 5 micron remain suspended in the air and are inhaled, and which becomes a problem to your lung. The following precautions should be taken before entering the airborne isolation room. Implement standard precautions. Place the patient in a single room with monitored negative airflow pressure, often referred to as negative pressure room. We need to emphasize to the staff of developing such a level of infrastructure to capture that these precautions of avoiding airborne transmission of diseases. Air should be discharged outdoors or filtered before recirculation. Keep doors always closed. Anyone entering the room must wear a high filtration, particularly respirator, which we called it as N95 mask. We have witnessed the same level of infection pressure during the COVID-19 period. Fit testing is required before donning an N95. Gown and cap not necessary are being advised. Remove the N95 mask outside the patient's room after closing the door. An N95 mask may be reused as per the manufacturer's instructions which are given. Limit movement and transport of patient. Only for essential purpose only we can allow. If the transportation is necessary, place a surgical mask on the patient to minimize dispersal of droplet nuclei, which can be again a source of hospital acquired infection. Check negative pressure frequently to ensure that the negative pressure is maintained. This way we can tackle with lot of airborne transmission. The diseases spread by airborne route are as open or active pulmonary tuberculosis, which has been witnessed as the major cause of mortality in healthcare associated infection, if though it is a pending. Measles, chickenpox, pulmonary plague, and hemorrhagic fever with pneumonia can be added into the list of diseases spread by airborne route. These are the isolation and airborne precaution. We need to see that how this isolation precautions, goals and scope versus actually to the airborne precaution implementation and protocol. What is the goal of isolation precautions? It is prevent transmission, where we need to see that the prevention of transmission has to see in first line reduce, that is reduce healthcare associated infection. The second is control multi-drug resistant organism, where you may find the huge pressure of MDR is coming mostly for tuberculosis. Then comes global health crisis response. So these are the three very important goals and you need to achieve it with a purpose and a respected audience. How it can be seen as? It is that you can see the recommendations for the setting, which comes with primary health centers, teaching hospitals, medical college hospital, long-term care giving institutions, and even private hospitals as well. This can be useful for a healthcare personnel as individual, even as administrators and infection control committee seekers. With respect now with the airborne precautions, implementations and protocols, we may see definition and transmission, where you may find that you need to focus more on what is a droplet nuclei, how it becomes remains suspended and inhaled, and we need to emphasize more on what are the required precautions and environment to tackle that, where you need to see that you need to create a negative airflow room, where you need to monitor it, where you have discharge outdoors or filtered, keep doors closed policy. With this, we can see the PPE and procedures also needs to come up, where you have to emphasize to your healthcare workers of wearing N95 mask fit tested, which is required for entry, and gown cap not necessary as a policy. Remove N95 mask outside the room need to be emphasized. For the patient, limit movement essential only can be allowed. Surgical mask needs to be there on the patient during the transport. With respect to monitoring and disease purpose, I may say that check negative pressure daily, where the airborne precautions and implementation protocols are to be followed. Where in diseases we may say pulmonary tuberculosis, measles, chickenpox as I have emphasized, and pulmonary plague and hemorrhagic fever with respect to pneumonia can be one of those diseases which can be seen as transmitted through airborne. Now we will discuss more on the droplet precaution. The transmission characteristics of the droplet precautions are like suspected to be infected by microorganism transmitted by large droplets, that is above 5 microns. So droplets are generated by the patient during coughing, sneezing, talking and respiratory procedures. Example, tracheal suctioning also. So these are the important things that your healthcare worker needs to understand when they have to see what are the ways we can prevent it. So droplet precautions will emphasize that the microorganisms that you have to study more in depth can be acquired by direct contact and with droplets up to 6 feet, as well as contact with objects contaminated with respiratory secretions. So this has to be dwell actually to those employees actually who are working closely on the infection control practices. Diseases spread by droplet includes pneumonia, pertussis, diphtheria, influenza. Influenza can be a seasonal or it can be even a pandemic also. Addition to it, diseases like mumps and meningitis can be there. So you may see what is the depth of the droplet precautions which you need to emphasize actually to your employees who are working in this area. The precautions to follow for the healthcare workers is like implement standard precautions. Place the patient in a single room or a room with another patient having the same pathogen, where you may not have a cross transmission. A negative pressure is not necessary over here. Wear a surgical mask when within 1 or 2 meters, that is 3 to 6 feet of a patient or a distance of a patient. Wear a non-sterile gown when working within 3 to 6 feet of the patient. Dispose of the mask appropriately outside the patient's room, rather not carrying it in the entire ward after completing the work with the patient. Place a surgical mask on the patient during transport, where it is essentially when the patient has to be traveled actually for the purpose of diagnostic or for reference. Special air handling ventilation is not required to prevent droplet transmission of infection. So these are the listed protocols that you have to see that these precautions need to be followed by your healthcare workers. Here we can see the portrait of droplet precaution, how a droplet precaution is there. So below 5 and with 3 to 6 foot, you have to see that the transmission of large droplets from coughing, sneezing and talking, where you have to keep a distance of 3 to 6 feet from the patient. Wear a surgical mask and a gown within 3 to 6 feet of a distance of the patient. Droplet precautions where surgical mask required for entry needs to be displayed in the healthcare setting, which is very important to see that while transmitting the patient or for a purpose which is essentially very required, you can see that a patient wears a mask during this transport. So droplet precaution instructions can be displayed where versus the training on this could be emphasized on whether they are following it properly or not. Healthcare workers need to be developed with the quality culture on understanding the issues with respect to droplet precautions, which can allow many times to reduce the infections to be transmitted. In last to this particular chapter, where in summary I would like to give you emphasis more on airborne precautions prevention. Airborne precautions prevents infection spread by droplet nuclei above 5 micron and require a negative pressure room. N95 respirators needs to be used properly. Closed door rooms are ones to be emphasized and limited patient movement, which is very important. With respect to droplet precautions that we see even in general outlets or even healthcare settings or even in hospitals, what we need to do on? We need to prevent this infection spread by the large droplets below 5 microns and require a surgical mask within 1 to 2 meters of the patient, with no need for special air handling, where it is found that droplet precautions prevention is much easier compared to airborne precautions. Airborne diseases include tuberculosis, measles, chickenpox, while droplet spread diseases include influenza, pertussis, diphtheria, mumps and meningitis, which is very important that droplet precaution spread needs to be tackled in a different way versus to airborne diseases precautions. For both this precaution, a mask should be placed on the patient during transport to minimize the spread, which is very common. You should try maximum to limit the movements of the patient, where whenever it is essential for the patient actually to go for any procedure or for diagnostic or for a reference, then only you should allow the patient for a movement. When the patient is on this movement, you should ask or you should try to emphasize more on developing culture actually to give instructions to your staff to put a mask to the patient. Standard precautions must always be followed along with this transmission based precaution, because without standard precautions or making a culture actually of standard precaution, you cannot really tackle this load of HAIs, which is very important for any organization who are working on quality. So this way you can lead a path of quality, or I mean to say patient safety culture. In the references which are being given, you can work on a project with respect to tackling this airborne and precautions actually for this. So thank you for listening it patiently.